Hello there, my teacher friends. Welcome to the Beyond Measure podcast, your home for professional camaraderie with me, Christina Whitlock. I hang out here on the internet to serve as your faithful anytime piano teacher friend, and I am so happy to share some time with you today. We are deep into the Summertime Conversation series, and today's conversation is an ultra important one. I'm talking today with Dr. Kate Boyd. She's a friend, colleague, professor of piano at Butler University. She's a YouTube star and an all-around terrific human being. You are definitely going to want to check out Kate's YouTube channel. She goes by The Piano Prof because Kate Boyd has a real knack for breaking down technical skills into succinct, easy to digest pieces of information. I know I've learned so much from her over the years, and I regularly direct my own students to her channel for further study. So friends, let's get on with today's chat with the piano prof herself, Dr. Kate Boyd. This is episode 175 of the Beyond Measure podcast. Kate Boyd, the piano prof, is here on the Beyond Measure podcast. Kate, welcome. We're so glad to have you today.
It's so great to be here today, Christina.
Well, I am excited to talk to you for a myriad of reasons, but today we're revisiting my episode. It's way back when, episode number 30, called Cheers to Your Local Teacher Friends. And I knew I wanted to talk to you about this topic because when I think of local teacher friends, and I'm using that somewhat flexibly because you're about an hour from me. So you're not super local, but we're pretty close. And I think you're just one of like the best surprises of my teacher friend life because I don't want to embarrass you, but when I first got to know you, I just felt like, that's Dr. Kate Boyd and she knows all these things. And here, come to find out, we have a lot in common. And the more that we work together in our mastermind that we meet with Amy Chaplin and Jana Williamson, the more I think it turns out that you and I have a lot of similar tendencies in that group. Would you agree?
I would agree. Yes. My feeling about it is that we both kind of react to things somewhat emotionally, and we both tend to overthink. Does that jive with your perception as well?
It totally jives. So you're the first one that I'm talking to this summer on the podcast. Jana and Amy will be up in the coming weeks. So
What an honor. What an honor. I hope to do the mastermind proud.
I think you're going to represent just fine. So this idea of making sure that you're building relationships with your local teacher friends, it can be easy or it can be really challenging because I think it's easy to get caught up in our impressions of local colleagues when until we actually try to get to know them, we really have no idea who they are or what they're about. So, like, I have been surprised by how many things you and I have in common. Have you ever been surprised by a musical colleague after getting to know them better?
Yeah, I think what you might be referring to also has to do with kind of our first impressions of people. And we meet them often in a professional context. And then once we get to know them and we kind of get past the professional exterior, then we can relate to them on a more personal way as we get to know them. And yes, I can relate to that. I had a colleague when I was teaching at a summer festival who my first impression of him was very negative. And it was because sometimes you come across musicians who are somewhat loquacious. They're a little bit of a diva. They seem to take up a lot of the oxygen in the room. And so when I first met this person, I was like, oh no, I just can't work with this person. How am I going to do this? Spend a summer working with this person. But then after working with that person, I realized that they are simply an extrovert. And actually, they're a great listener. And he is one of my closest friends now. We text all the time, we visit with each other, we see each other a lot. And it's just an example of somebody that I ordinarily, if I had bumped into him just once, would have possibly written off and maybe tried to avoid professionally. But then once I got to know him, we became incredibly close friends.
Mm. I really love that story. And it's happened to me so many times over. I I was thinking about this in regards to myself recently that for whatever reason, despite the fact that when I meet somebody new, I tend to assume that they have their life more together than I do. Like I've realized that this is very much a posture that I bring to any new relationship I have. But also, there's something within me that is just like determined to be friends with everyone that I meet. And so I think that does work in my favor in this profession, in that I do make those judgments and I do see these just really strong personalities and perceptions of people, but then I'm just determined to win them over in whatever way necessary. And I don't know what that says about me, but it's just fun to think about. But it has benefited me. I know in my local teacher circles, there have been, through my history living here, some teachers that were deemed difficult to work with by some of my colleagues. And I've just made it a point to make sure that I stay on good terms with all of my
Mhm.
local teacher friends and avoid drama at all possible turns.
That's something that I really admire about you, Christina, is that you really bring people together and you really build bridges between people and you find the commonality between people. And as evidenced by the fact that you created a podcast about piano teaching and it's for your piano teacher friends. And so this is obviously a core value of yours and it's something that really shapes the way that you are in the profession and we're all better off for it.
Oh, thank you. I'm so glad you noticed that. When I think about my personality, I'm like, oh, it really is all here on a silver platter here on the podcast, isn't it?
Mhm.
So I'll tell you this. My husband has these running jokes that when I take him to classical musical events or teacher conferences or whatever, he always identifies himself as being like from the third class since he doesn't have the classical musical training that we all have. So obviously he's kidding. But I do think that sometimes there feels like this hierarchy in the musical world. Like, there sits you, Dr. Kate Boyd, the full time professor with her big performance credits on your CV. And I know that I've been guilty of placing myself in like a different class than people with different credits than mine. So I know that you don't want others to place you on that kind of pedestal, but there are these stigmas that somehow collegiate faculty are in this upper echelon in the teaching world. You've even poked fun at this in your earliest version of your email newsletter because you called it, I love this, Notes from the Ivory Tower, which is a play on that whole idea that collegiate faculty sit in this ivory tower, right?
And
Um,
also that piano has ivory keys.
and also that the piano has ivory keys. I love it. So tell me what comes to mind when I tell you that sometimes independent teachers can feel sometimes less than or in a different category than collegiate faculty.
Well, it's interesting because, first of all, the reason I changed the name of my email newsletter is because I was concerned that calling it Notes from the Ivory Tower, although I meant it tongue in cheek, could sound elitist. And it's very important to me not to appear elitist because I don't consider, like, it makes me a little bit sad when you talk about your husband calling himself from the third class because I really feel like I look around this profession
Mhm.
and I see it's so multifaceted and has so many different ways of being in the profession and ways of educating people. And it's important that people are in all pieces of that. And I don't see one component of it as better than or more than or less than others. And I truly hope that teachers who are teaching at whatever level, at whatever amount of teaching, whatever amount of education they have, whatever kind of student they have, that they just feel like they're part of a large community of musicians and educators. And I think it's really important to value all members of the community. And when I look at independent teachers in particular, sure, I'm a university professor. I am a full professor, which means that I was on the tenure track, and then I got tenure, and then 6 years later, I submitted another 3 binders of materials, and then I became full professor. And so that means that I have this role at a university, and that's a different path than an independent teacher might have taken. However, there are a lot of advantages to being an independent teacher that a tenured professor doesn't have. For example, you are a small business owner. You can determine your own rules and conditions for work. It's a much more nimble way to be in the world because you don't have to work within the bureaucracy of an institution. I feel like there's a lot of advantages in that too. You don't have to go to any committee meetings. You don't have to submit syllabuses with student learning outcomes on them and to make sure that they match the university and School of Music learning outcomes and all that kind of stuff. And then you also are in a position of working with students in a different demographic. Like when I work with students at the undergraduate and graduate level, they have had a lot of training in the past, and I'm in the position of remediating or enhancing or dealing with them in the context of being transfer students. But if you're working with younger students, you are in a position where you can set them up for life. You can really make an impact. The other thing about being an independent teacher that's a real advantage is you can work with students for a longer time. I have a built-in 4-year limit to the undergraduates that I work with, and then they move on and do something else, go somewhere else. And if you work with a 7-year-old, you can work with them and see them grow up from ages 7 all the way into high school. And so that's a completely different level of involvement. You get involved with their families. You can really nurture and have an impact on a child at a different part of their life. And so one's not better than the other. Both have pros and cons, and it's not humanly possible for any one person to fill all of those roles. And I didn't even talk about music education in the schools. Those people have an entirely different role to play. And if any piece of that is gone, then the whole music profession suffers, because without independent teachers providing students with a good foundation and sending them on to music programs, then the university music programs wouldn't have any students and wouldn't be able to then move people into the profession past the university. And the same thing, if we didn't have any university programs, then people would just be able to take kind of like recreational music. And then when they're done, it would be a very unclear path for the students who were really interested in pursuing music. So that's kind of a long answer, but when I look around the profession, don't feel like, okay, well, here's a hierarchy and there's a ladder and I'm at rung 9 and there's somebody else who's rung 11 above me because they teach in a better school or whatever. What do you think?
Mm-hmm. Oh, I agree. I'm laughing as you're saying all of that because when I was a student working through my degrees, you feel like that tenure track full professor job is the ultimate goal. I feel like sometimes it's sold to us as like the dream profession. I'm very content that that is not the path that I ended up on, not because I think it's terrible, but because I think independent teaching is a better fit for me. I find it really fascinating that we all just find our paths. And when it comes to being a quote, better performer, a better pianist, I think sometimes that's mostly bred from those of us who perceive ourselves perhaps to be lower on the ladder. And it's just so faulty. And I think that's my main point with this whole topic for today is I would love to see independent teachers stop viewing themselves as though they either had something to prove or needed to apologize for attempting to be in the profession or anything like that.
It's not like there's a finite number of potential piano students or potential performance opportunities in the world. And if you don't get one of those, then you aren't going to have an opportunity. And I think that one wonderful thing about our profession is that we can create new opportunities where we don't see opportunities. And so, for example, if I want to have a performance opportunity, I can create a performance opportunity. I don't have to wait for some concert presenter to call me up and offer me this or that. I can find a place to play and find a date and invite people and publicize it. And then next thing I know, there's a concert, right? And then when you collaborate with people, right now, for example, I'm rehearsing a piece that two colleagues and I from Butler commissioned. And so we're working with a composer and we've been rehearsing it. We're going to premiere it at the International Double Reed Society conference in Flagstaff in July. And so that's a really exciting thing that didn't exist. It did not exist before we had the idea to commission this. And it's going to be a new piece for the ensemble of oboe, bassoon, and piano. So it'll sit alongside the famous Poulenc trio. And so I just really feel that it's not a zero-sum game. And so if any of the listeners of this podcast are feeling discouraged or feeling jealous of maybe other people that they see in the community, I would encourage you to think about, well, what is it that that person has or is doing that you're envious of? Because that's often a signal to you that maybe there's something that you wish you were doing more of. Mm-hmm. So if you are teaching a lot of students and then a colleague of yours is performing some chamber music, you might feel a little jealous of that. And that's a signal, not that you're worse or anything like that, but that maybe you also are interested in playing some chamber music. And so maybe you need to carve out a little bit more practice time than you have been in the past. And maybe you can kind of start asking around, looking for colleagues to do some reading sessions with, and start to fill that need within yourself.
That's so funny you say that, because I swear you and I have not had this conversation, but I am actively very aware of the fact that I miss playing chamber music. And I've been talking to some of my local instrumental colleagues like, hey, let's put something together because I miss that collaboration. So it's so funny that that was your example.
Absolutely. And that's how it happens. And that's how it has always happened. You know, yeah. I'm reading a biography of Fanny Mendelssohn right now. And it's interesting to read about how professional communities worked back then. And what would happen is somebody would write a piece, they would ask musicians they know, they would perform it together. And then like Fanny Mendelssohn had every other week at her home a little concert series. And so she was from a very rich family. And so they had a very nice home and they would throw the doors to the garden open and then it would seat 200 people. And wow. So they lived in Berlin and then people would come through and they would know about like, oh, we could go perform at their house. And she had a guest list, but it was all private. It was all just word of mouth. It wasn't like there was some agent involved or whatever. And so I think people often think there are gatekeepers when there are not gatekeepers. We're often our own gatekeepers. And so if we can kind of get past the self-imposed limitations, then there's so much more that's possible for us as professionals and as people.
Wow. I love hearing you say those things because I don't know, you're helping me like self-actualize my life here and this mission that I'm on. Because when you were talking about competition, you drummed up this memory that I have burned into my brain that I grew up like in high school and middle school going to all of these summer camps and we would be so silly, but it was just so much fun, right? Lots of good music making, but also lots of chaos ensuing with these friends that we would be completely goofballs with. And I remember showing up to an undergraduate audition at a pretty exclusive school when I was auditioning my senior year of high school. And I ran into several of these kids that I was having toothpaste fights with in the bathroom just a summer ago or whatever. And they wanted nothing to do with me. It's like something just shifted in their mind and I was competition and I was no longer their friend. And it was wild to me because you can imagine me, I'm bopping around like, hey, how's it going? And they were like, just staring at me. It was terrible. And I was like, oh, what has happened? And I remember my freshman year of undergrad, I was not at that school, and I was preparing a freshman recital. And my professor and I were sitting in the green room before my recital, and my studio mates kept coming in the door, and they were like, "Oh, good luck! You're gonna play really well," all those things. And I remember they left, and my professor looked at me and he said, "You realize this is not what usually happens, right? This is not the way of most communities." And I was like, yeah, I get that now. And it was so great to have this community where my studio mates were wishing me well instead
Yeah.
of sitting out there hoping that I was going to fall on my face.
Yeah.
And I think you do that really well in your studio as well, right? You foster that
Oh,
sense of
yeah. I
community.
mean, it's just so important to me. And nothing makes me happier than to see my students after studio class all go to Starbucks together as a regular weekly occurrence. And they write each other little post-it notes, and they all decorated all the practice rooms together. And they are so excited if any of them wins a competition, even if multiple of them are competing in it, they just want each other to do well. And I feel like, have you ever seen that show, The Great British Baking Show?
Yes.
I love that
Yes,
show. And
I do
it's,
too.
and one thing I love about it is that's kind of the model. That's the dream, right? That everybody just takes joy and pleasure in each other's accomplishments and yet still strives to do their best. So they know ultimately somebody does have to win. So, like, there's a certain amount of inherent competitiveness in human nature, right? But we can kind of choose how we channel that. And I think what you're describing too is a little bit of the difference between being in your 20s and being like in your 40s. That when you're younger and you're uncertain about how your path in music is going to proceed, I mean, there's nobody there from the future to say, oh, don't worry about it because you're going to have professional and financial success and you're going to be fine. You're not going to have to quit and do a different thing. There's nobody from the future promising you that. So there's a lot of just insecurity about like, how am I going to make this happen? The great thing about our profession is that it's multifaceted, but the thing that's harder is that there's not one set path that you then just do step A, step B, step C, and then you come out the other end with some kind of very set professional life. And so when you're in that phase of uncertainty, it is easy to see the people around you as competing for the same scarce resources. I'm starting to see that people in their 20s, I think, are more collaborative than they used to be, and that people are starting to understand, oh, wait a second, we can actually create things in the profession now. We don't have to just do it all by ourselves and then figure it out later. That's at least what I'm seeing at like MTNA conferences, and I'm seeing that with students in my studio and then other students I meet in different places. But that is definitely a challenge, that feeling of insecurity, which is really where competition comes from.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, I think we should wrap up, sadly, but tell everyone what you're up to these days and where they can find you online.
Well, a couple years ago, I started a YouTube channel called The Piano Prof. And true to form, just like Christina and I overthink everything, I spent about 3 weeks agonizing over the title, The Piano Prof, because Piano Prof was already taken. And I didn't want to write it The Piano Prof because I didn't want people to think like I somehow think I'm the only or ultimate piano prof. And so 3 weeks of overthinking that, and then I settled on The Piano Prof. Anyway, so my YouTube channel is called The Piano Prof. I also have a weekly email newsletter that I send out, and you can sign up for that. I send out a practice tip every week and a little bit of something to think about with some questions, some of my favorite things, links to my latest YouTube videos, and so forth. And yeah, so that's where you can find me.
Well, I just have to say, I love the newsletter so much. Right now, it comes out on Sundays, and it's my kind of read. It's sort of, it's always reflective and somewhat deep thinking. It's very on brand with me as well. And so I love it. But it's also really practical because you do give us these great practice tips and a quote. And anyway, it's really well done. So bravo to you and your newsletter. And of course, your channel, which everyone should be watching. So, Kate Boyd, the piano prof, tell us something that you love beyond measure, and no serious answers allowed.
Okay. Well, one thing that I just love so much is anything that involves being outside. So I love hiking. I love traveling and being in the mountains. I'm looking forward to going to Oregon and exploring that in July because I'll be at the Oregon Music Teachers Association State Conference. And I also love gardening. So anything that gets me outside. Yes. Is that too serious?
No, it's a
Okay.
great answer. And I think there's something about it. Like I feel that way when I get to spend time outdoors, like I feel strangely happy to be outside. I guess it's because we've just spent so much of our life locked up in practice rooms inside, right?
Yeah.
There's something
Yeah.
so joyous about the sun and
Yes. And
wind.
fresh air and
Yes.
plants and dirt.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yes.
My happiest
Oh,
days are when I'm practicing and I have dirt under my fingernails.
oh, oh, I love that. That's really beautiful. Put that in the newsletter. All right, Kate. So I end every episode with a little toast to the profession, and I'm curious if I can throw the ball to you on that today. Do you want to give us a toast?
Yes. All right. Cheers to confidence in ourselves. May we learn how to get out of our own way to create opportunities and overcome our self-limiting beliefs. Hear, hear.
Hear, hear. Oh, that was good. Thank you so much for joining us today, Kate.
Such a pleasure. I always love talking to you, Christina.
Well, we'll continue that in the Patreon community. So everyone can join us there for a chat about university life. All right. Take care, Kate.
Bye-bye.
That's a wrap on this episode, friends. But remember, there is more where that came from. Head to christinawhitlock.com/Patreon to learn more about how you can get access to all kinds of bonus goodies for just a few dollars this summer. I am convinced the Patreon community is pretty much the most affordable professional development on the internet. Pay special attention to the new offering called What Should I Teach Next? Because it's really good, if I do say so myself. One more favor to ask of you today. If you love this show, will you please take a moment and share it with other teacher friends? I know there are more teachers out there who need an anytime piano teacher friend in their lives, and I am ready and willing to do the job. Thanks in advance, my friends. That'll do it for today. Onward and upward toward making the world a more musical place.